Hi everyone, welcome to another edition of the Svarim Chatter podcast. On this episode of the podcast, I'm going to be joined once again by Dovi Safier, noted writer and researcher of Jewish history, and specifically Yeshiva history. And this episode of the podcast will be discussing his new article, forthcoming. It'll actually be out. You'll be hearing this podcast the week of Sukkos. It'll be out this week, and the article is titled Crowning Glory, The Lost Empire of Radomsk, and the article is about 35 pages, so anyone familiar with Dovi's Yom Tov articles in Mishpacha magazine, they're pretty big. They're articles, but they're quite lengthy. So thank you, Dovi, for joining me once again.
Thanks for having me.
So I think you've been on the podcast a bunch of times. I don't remember if we discussed this, so I'll start off by asking you a general question that I'm sure some, listeners that read your stuff and have heard you are interested in. How did you become interested in history, and specifically yeshiva history? And although I will say this article, Radomsk Chasidus, there is a big yeshiva component here, and that's why you're writing this article, as we'll get to. So how did you become interested in history, specifically yeshiva history?
You know what? I've been asked that question a million times, and I don't think there's one singular answer, but I read a lot growing up. I tried to keep things kosher. I think I stopped reading novels by the time I was 10 or 11 because I realized, why should I be reading novels if I could be reading history, which really, clearly, was love at first sight. So I read everything, anything history related, and I'm talking about, at one point I was into Eisenhower, and a different time I was into World War I. And eventually I realized that within the frum world, there aren't that many experts on the history of the yeshivas, primarily, let's say, starting with the modern, the modern version of the yeshiva, starting with Volozhin in 1802, 1803, up into the war. And then, you could talk about, I could say I know pretty well the history of even yeshivas in America, beginning with the early ones like Reitz and RJJ, but anything that happened, as my Mishpacha compadre, Yehuda Geber, likes to say, we don't really know anything that happened after Rav Aaron Kotler died. So we don't really go much into the 70s, 80s, but maybe some anecdotes here and there. But this is definitely something that I feel like, because I attended yeshivas, I feel like sometimes if something's part of your life, you definitely can relate to it. And I feel like, one of my mentors, the late, great Rabbi Chil Per, who was the Rosh Yeshiva of Yeshiva Rakoy, who passed away this past year, who was someone who really studied history, knew his history, and knew many people who made history, once told me, he said, Dovi, he says, it's great to study history, it's great to teach history, but it's most importantly, make history. So I feel like, you live it, but, it's great to do all this stuff, but ultimately you want to make history.
So how did you start writing history, and specifically Mishpacha magazine? That's mainly where you write, and now you have this weekly column for the record you do with Yehuda. But these Yom Tov articles, so call them, these lengthy articles that become like an highly anticipated event. You have, hard to top the Jenny Miller one, right? Of course. But how did it start just in general writing, and then specifically that you have Sukkos and Pesach and Mishpacha, these massive articles?
So I started with Mishpacha. I have a friend whose name is Yisrael Besser. Some of you know him, who still writes at Mishpacha. I wouldn't say full time, but many years, was their featured writer. During COVID, everyone had kind of their COVID project, and mine was to finally take my writing public. I did ghostwriting here and there. I think my first job ever, I guess I could admit it now, I had a little business in high school. I'd write term papers for kids that were in college. They wanted to pay me. I did quite well doing that. I'm not going to name any of the suspects. But I think that I've always enjoyed writing. I've had a knack for it. I went to a yeshiva, Darchei Torah in Radomsk growing up, where they really gave us all the tools to learn how to write. We had great teachers. But most of all, my parents, to my grandparents, it was just something in the family. Reading, writing, less arithmetic. So, as they would say.
And so these are long articles, though. The long form articles specifically, the Yom Tov ones, how did that come about?
You know what? I feel like there are a couple of qualifications in order for me to write an article. I feel like there's the Jenny Miller even Radomsk probably falls into this, somewhat, Rav Leib Malin. I'm just trying to think of a bunch of them that I've done. And those are the ones that people really, I mean, Jenny, nobody knew anything about. And then let's say Radomsk and Rav Leib Malin, people know very little about, if at all. I think by now you'd agree that Rav Leib Malin, we've kind of really, all the Yeshiva Bachram, learn this Torah now. That they think about, okay, I read that article and I know about it. So that's, I would say, is one. Number two is taking a figure, like last year I did Chacham Blin, I've done Rav Chanan Wasserman, Rav Shmuel Rozovsky, I've done many different, just going off the top of my head, I'll leave out a few, but I did Ara Belzer once. But these are figures that people know about, but I feel like they never really got the full story. Whether the story was very much censored, or they missed. Nobody really researched it properly, because in the film world there aren't that many people that do research. There are writers, but a lot of them don't go out and actually do the archival research. Go and sit in the library for a couple of weeks and really try and find out every single thing they could about something. A lot of it is just interview based, and hey, this guy told me that guy told me that, so that's the book, and that's fine, and that's what most people are fine with that in the film world. But I was trying to do something a little bit more sophisticated, and I feel like once I was doing these articles, I didn't want to leave out that many details. So I think some people would probably call these books, and sometimes we've done them as separate pamphlets, which they like. But the Yom Tov ones, I think they have to sell, amongst the 200 pages of ads, they need some content. Obviously, there's a lot of content. But these articles usually are the centerpiece of these Yom Tov articles. At least if you enjoy history, it definitely becomes a centerpiece.
I think what I've heard from people, even those that aren't, major history buffs, do really enjoy these articles. Like you said, it adds something really of substance to the magazine. Not that the rest of it isn't substance, but this is really some, real big piece that you can sink your teeth into and work through. And of course, it's laid out beautifully. There's color pictures, a lot of pictures. It's done really nicely and done well. So there is that. So why Radomsk? We get to, and I think in that question, you should probably explain to the listeners who aren't familiar what Radomsk is. I will just say also that, of course, everyone should go and buy Mishpacha magazine this week and and they can read the article there. It's in the Mega Sukkos edition. But with that, at least, we're going to talk about it. There's obviously the articles, like I said, 35 pages. It's really, I read the article, enjoyed it very much. So, Dovi, why Radomsk? What is Radomsk, the Chasidus?
So Radomsk was, I would say, before the war, one of what I would term the big three. The three big Hasidic dynasties in Congress Poland before the Second World War. There was Ger and Alexander, and I would say Radomsk was third, probably a distant third. How you measure these things, many scholars and historians have argued about this, how many shtibels they had, how many followers they had. There really is no great way to measure it. But you would say that in Congress Poland, Radomsk was third. And Radomsk was very unique, especially, everyone or most people are familiar with the Torah. Shlomo was the first Rebbe of Radomsk. The subject of my article is the fourth Rebbe, who is his namesake, Shlomo Chanoch Rabinowitz, Shlomo Chanoch Hakohen Rabinowitz. But Radomsk was different in many ways. I think there was a very personal relationship between the Radomsk Rebbe and his Hasidim in a way that, I feel, I'll be honest, I'm not Hasidish myself. I like to say, maybe I've said it on your podcast before, is that one of my grandfathers comes from Vilna, the other one comes from my other grandfather comes from Lezhensk. So I love to hear Hasidish stories. I just don't always believe them. But in the case of Radomsk, this is not an article full of Hasidic mises, whether you like them or don't like them. It's not a story, it's not a story of a miracle worker. And there are many stories of the Rebbes of Radomsk being miracle workers. This is a story of a Rebbe who was different in many ways. It's different because he was an industrialist, he was a very wealthy man, and he used his money not to build palaces, not to have golden chariots. Not like there's anything wrong with that, but the Rebbe saw an issue at the time, which we'll get to, and he decided to take his money, his vast wealth, and tackle it. And I went into this article as a pessimist saying, hey, this is probably, okay, was the Rebbe a very, very wealthy man? Maybe he had a few dollars, but he couldn't have been, like some of the articles say, like among the richest Jews in all of Poland. Turns out that was very true, and became, like an anti-Semitic trope that was often used in the pro-Nazi Polish publications, and how the Jews are taking over the world and things like that. And they would talk about, all of his vast holdings. But he really was a very wealthy man, and he used his money to build a yeshiva system, which I'll say right from the onset, which really shocked me, because I think it peaked somewhere around 4,000, depending on who you ask, anywhere between 3,000 and 5,000 talmidim, which is probably larger than all of the Lithuanian yeshivas, which I love to romanticize, combined. So, and Lithuanian yeshivas, we have pretty good numbers from, because of the Vadi Yeshivas, and Vadi Yeshivas archive survived. So Mir and Kamenetz and Telz and Panovich and Grodno and Radin, the Kesser Torah Yeshiva System of Radomsk, which we'll discuss in depth a little bit more, it was something that, it was larger than all of those yeshivas combined. And I would say, as somebody who has studied the yeshivas of the interwar period, it eluded me, mostly. I think it eludes most people. But when I got into researching Chachmei Lublin last year, I saw a bunch of different anecdotes about it. Shal Stamfer, who wrote an article about Chassidish yeshivas during the interwar period, was probably the first person to bring it to my attention. I discussed it with him once in person a little bit, but the great Shal Stamfer, should I say, someone who's been very, very important to my growth as a writer, researcher, and so-called historian. He discusses it, and I was shocked to hear about this Kesser Torah Yeshiva network, which I never knew anything about. And I would say the rest is history.
Yeah, as you said there, that it's not an article about, Chassidish mises, and it's really not. And maybe that's why I enjoyed it so much personally. But it's a very, like I said, an enjoyable article. But let's talk about, there's a little sidebar where you talk a little bit about the Torah Shlomo, but that's not what it's about. It's not focused on, it's not even focused on Radomsk Chasidus as a whole. It's more focused on the last Rebbe of Radomsk, Shlomo Chanoch Hakohen Rabinowitz, and him personally, a little bit of Chasidus, and really the yeshiva system. That's really what you focused on. So let's talk about the Rebbe. His biography, when he was born, 1882, I think, and his life. And, you mentioned that he was very rich, and there's something you talk about in the article, and he really was a business tycoon. How did he get into business? How did he become so rich? What's the story with that?
So Shlomo Chanoch was I say, it said the fourth Rebbe of Radomsk, born in 1882. And the previous three Rebbes of Radomsk all died fairly young, and diabetes ran in the family. We know that his father, the Knesset Yecheskel Rabinowitz, and his father, Chesed Avram, they both died very young, 40s, I think, maybe 50, somewhere in that range, because of diabetes. Now, something changed in that Shlomo Chanoch, when he became of age, insulin became available, widely available, I guess, in the 20s, and that all of a sudden he said, he realized that he was going to be able to live longer than the others, and that the Radomsk dynasty would live on a little bit longer. But he became the Rebbe in 1910, following his father's passing. He did not learn in any yeshivas you would recognize. He was not as much. He tried to stay out of the public eye early on. It was never even simple to get him to become Rebbe. In fact, he went into business after he got married. He married a cousin, like most Rebbes do, or most Rebbes did. And his father had owned a business. I wouldn't say he was an industrialist like he was, but somehow Shlomo Chanoch, I don't have the details of how he really made it very, very big. One of the stories they say is how during World War I, which was shortly, you have to realize that the dynasty was located in Radomsk, right? And during the Rebbe, because he had diabetes, would often travel to Germany for treatments. And during World War I, he was in Hamburg, ended up in Berlin, and he started buying properties there, many. And after World War I, when I guess soldiers returned home, the property has increased in value tremendously. Actually, he was arrested, like many other foreign citizens or foreign nationals were during World War One, and he was held by the Alexander Rebbe, I would say a rival Rebbe, who had a chassid who had connections over there and was able to get him out and convince them he was not a spy, he was just a Rebbe and he was there for medical treatments. And unlike others who during World War One, I believe Alter of Slobodka is a figure who, was expelled during World War One. He was sent like in a sealed train out to the Russian interior. But he was able to stay in Germany. And he built up his business, and he owned real estate all over Germany and Poland. He owned a glass factory, textile factory, brick factory, and you could actually go. I went through the Polish newspapers, and you'll find lots of articles about the Rebbe establishing businesses. And what he always did was when he established a business, he took one of his Hasidim and made them the CEO of that business. And by doing so, he was able to create wealth in his Chasidus. And he did not have to run day-to-day operations of his business because he had Hasidim. And, the Rebbe doesn't have to worry about trusting Hasidim because Hasidim, inherently, are pretty beholden to the Rebbe. And it was a way to provide parnasa for them, whether they were CEOs or just workers in these factories. So it was something very unique in that sense.
So he becomes Rebbe. He's young. His father was 46, alluded to the medical issues, and he's 29 years old when his father dies. So he's very young. But interestingly, you mentioned Radomsk, but the Chasidus was still called Radomsk, but he didn't establish his Hasidic court, if you will. It was not in Radomsk. He established it elsewhere. Why did he do that?
Well, I wouldn't say he established it in Radomsk. He was located there until World War One. When he came back from Germany after World War One, he moved to Sosnovich. Why Sosnovich? First of all, I think that there was a broader trend of urbanization when it came to Rebbes after World War One. For example, the Chartkover Rebbe, right, who was one of the Rebbe of Meir Shapiro, and one of the leading Rebbes at the time. He moved his court to Vienna, right, and they famously say that the Rebbe moved his court to Vienna, and they asked him why, and he said that I sound like Shlomo Kalbach. He was on his way to Yerushalayim, and Vienna is closer to Yerushalayim, and he wasn't ready to turn back, and he stayed in Vienna. But the Rebbes were moving to Warsaw. I would say from Congress, Poland, Rebbes from Galicia, were settling in Vienna where they had gone during the First World War, and a general trend of urbanization was happening everywhere after World War One. So why shouldn't the Rebbes be in the larger cities? Sosnovich was significantly larger than Radomsk. It was also kind of in a better location when it came to bordering Galicia and Congress, Poland. So Hasidim, which he had spread out all over, could reach him there. It was also, as you often find, and my to go back to Yehuda Geber has taught me, follow the train lines. And Sosnovich was a major crossroads when it came to the railroad, and that was good for business. That was good for getting Hasidim there. Not everyone is Ger and gets their own train line built for them.
So, that's the Rebbe, and he does there. Okay, you mentioned the yeshiva system. This is a big part of Radomsk. Obviously, the article really focused on this. This is your connection here. Although, like you said, you did bells, you've done Chasidus before. So, the Kesser Torah Yeshiva System. Why did he found this system? What was it? How big was it? Obviously, by the way, for more information on all these topics, go read the article once again. But okay, what can you say about the yeshiva system?
I think there was a major issue facing the Jewish youth in all across Eastern Europe at the time, which was World War One threw the world in disarray. We all know so much about World War Two, and World War One is often forgotten. But what World War One did was really break up the various kehilas. It broke up families. It broke up Jewish life as we knew it. 5, 6, 7 years, there were people that were refugees, just worrying about how to live, just trying to stay alive. Fathers were often on the front fighting. Fathers were often killed. Mothers were sometimes killed. And sometimes children were literally running around in packs alone. And you had, obviously Jews were being accused by both sides of being spies, of being traitors. We all know what happened in Poland immediately after the war. We know what happened in Ukraine right after the war. But what happens whenever there's a war, the Jews end up right in the middle of things. And as a result of that, the system for the study of Torah really needed an overhaul. And I think there were a few people like Rameir Shapiro understood that. But I think the Shlomo Chanoch, the Rebbe of Radomsk, he really understood that the problem and believed the problem was that the Hasidim had previously not studied in what we would term yeshivas. They studied in smaller groups, in some base medrash somewhere. No formal Hasidic yeshivas, really. Bells that you would call Yeshvim, they would come to the court of the Rebbe and they would learn there. But there was no formal system of yeshivas. And now, in the wake of World War I, where everything was kind of the Wild West, and the trend of urbanization gave an opportunity, with Jews living, a lot of them, in these urban centers in Krakow, in Warsaw, in Lodz. Hey, let's open these yeshivas. Let's try and make it the systematic group. Eventually became this, I would call it, network of yeshivas where things can become more orderly. They would be learning under proper Rosh Yeshiva. There would be testing. There would be, as we will discuss soon, the Kesser Torah journal, which gave them an opportunity. Those who really shined were able to display their wares, so to speak. It really was something that really was, it was taken from the Litvish yeshivas in some ways, and we'll see how. In other ways, it was definitely had a Hasidic charm and a Hasidic warmth to it, which was different.
Well, that's interesting. And if you want to just follow up on that, it was taken from the Litvish yeshivas. There was like Litvish influence. What was the influence on this yeshiva?
Well, I think in general, the idea of yeshivas, in the sense that we understand it today, is a Litvish idea. The other thing that I think that you'd be surprised to learn, I was shocked to learn, is that kachim was something that was learned in these yeshivas, and we don't know exactly where that came from. One of the important characters in the story is Moshe Rabinowitz, the Rebbe's son-in-law, who also was his cousin, obviously. And he was one of the greats, and one of those, the series Eila Esker, the series of books Eila Esker, which talks about the great rabbinic martyrs of the Holocaust. The article about Rav Moshe is a must read. We get into him a lot in this article. But he was one of the great minds, great Torah minds in Poland at the time. Even the Litvisher, like someone like Rav Chaim Isaac Guzensky, when he saw some of his Torah, really went wild over it. There's a video that we found. It's really Besser actually found it. From at a Gouda convention, probably in the 70s. And his grandfather, Chatzkel Besser, the legendary Chatzkel Besser, is speaking, and he says over a story, where one of his very close friends, Herschel Eisenstadt, who was a fascinating figure. He had learned by Rav Chaim, by the Brisker Rav later, and he was the one of the Chachmei Lublin Rosh Yeshivas in exile when the 40 or so Talmidim had escaped to Vilna during the war. He was very involved in Hatzalah efforts, and when he arrived in Vilna after he escaped from Poland, he came to Rav Chaim Ozer. And Rav Chaim Ozer started asking him about what was the fate of various Polish Gedolim whom he was associated with, and he said, "What's with Rav Moshe?" And Herschel Eisenstadt shook his head like he's not sure, and Chaim Ozer seemed very concerned, and Herschel says, "What's your connection?" It seemed like it was almost like someone's family there. He was so concerned, and he says, "Oh, Rav Moshe, he's one of the Gedolim. He's one of our greats." And that he didn't, and Rav Chaim Ozer didn't call everyone a gadol. It wasn't today where everyone was considered a gadol. So he was a great one, and he was someone that was obviously as Kohanim, in the same vein as Rav Kook, in the same vein as Chafetz Chaim, Rameir Shapiro. He took that, he really got that concept from Chafetz Chaim. I think the learning of Kachim, Rav Moshe would talk about being prepared for the Avodah in the Beis Hamikdash. But they definitely would learn Kachim, but they would learn they would learn pretty much the yeshivish masechtas in general, and then I think at some point they were learning pretty much all of shots. But there was also the kibbutz kavaya, which was the elite of the elite in the Radomsk system. So like Chachmei Lublin was an elite yeshiva. Some will say, okay, Chachmei Lublin was really the first, that style yeshiva in Poland, but Kesser Torah, the Kesser Torah yeshivas were a network which really you could show up there when you're 13, 14 years old, and Bacham all the way up to the age of 20. And the elite yeshiva where Talmidim from the various Kesser Torah yeshivas were sent was run by some Belzer Chassid named Rav Yosef Lasser. Rav Moshe would say shiurim there twice a week, and that was the creme de la creme of the great ones. And there was a lot of back and forth, a lot of Talmidim that went from this kibbutz to Chachmei Lublin, and from Chachmei Lublin to the kibbutz, back and forth. I think there was a healthy rivalry between the two. Rav Moshe even, there's all these stories about different people. There's something, a misconception worth clearing up. You hear stories about different people that were invited by Rav Meir Shapiro to be the Rosh Yeshiva of Chachmei Lublin. I wouldn't say they were invited to be the Rosh Yeshiva Chachmei Lublin, not like YU where there are many, many Rosh Yeshivas and everyone's a Rosh Yeshiva. This is somewhere in between, but he wanted to build a staff of Rosh Yeshiva, Magidi Shiurim, that was the greatest in Europe. Menachem Zemba was one of them. So he invited Rav Moshe during his lifetime to come be Rosh Yeshiva there. And then again, when Rav Meir Shapiro passed away, the yeshiva, their top four choices for Rosh Yeshiva, the Rosh Yeshiva initially were Rav Menachem Zemba, the Kasher Goverglein, the Chabina Rav. I guess you could say the Rogachover, although they never thought it actually would happen. They knew it would never happen, and Rav Moshe. And Rav Moshe turned him down. He had his own yeshiva, he had his own allegiances, obviously.
Yeah, and Rav you talk about it more in the article. Also, he was married to the Rebbe's only daughter, so he was in line to take over Radomsk to become the next Rebbe as well. That's important point. And you talk in the article, he has many chidushim he wrote, and he wanted to print it, and then the Rebbe told him not to print it, so it never got printed. Unfortunately, was lost. We don't have all these. He was going to write. He published. They're ready to go to print. But something else about the yeshiva. So, how many yeshivas at its height? How many yeshivas were there, and how many bachrim? Do we know how many bachrim there were in the system as a whole?
So, yes. So I think I mentioned earlier, the number that's often used is 4,000. I've seen estimates of 3,000. I've seen 5,000 at its peak. And this was spread across 36 different yeshivas in cities like Krakow, and Lodz, and even Sosnovich. There were more than one yeshiva. In fact, interestingly, one of the yeshivas, as you'll see in the article, there's a whole spread of beautiful pictures of Bachram from Kesser Torah, young Bachram from Kesser Torah yeshivas. One of the yeshiva katanas of Kesser Torah was located in Krakow at no less than the Ramashul, or in the complex where the Ramashul was. And these pictures were taken on Lag BaOmer, where the great Hilula of the Ramah took place. Today people go to Meron. Then obviously couldn't reach Meron, and the Ramah's yahrzeit was Lag BaOmer. It was a site, a big pilgrimage where thousands of people would come. So you see them there with a big sign, by the basic forest, where you can see where the yeshiva was. The basic forest is attached to the shul there. Anyone who's been there, and there was a small Kesser Torah yeshiva there. So some of the yeshivas are located in Shtiblach around Poland. Some of them had their own beautiful buildings, and these were all funded 50% by the Rebbe, 50% by his Chasidim in that town. Mainly, these Chasidim were the industrialists that he had set up in these positions that were very wealthy men. So the yeshivas did not do fundraising, which was extremely unique. So that led to, it was kind of a joke. They would say that the 36 yeshivas at Radomsk were like the Lamed Vav Tzadikim. They were great, but nobody really knew they were. There was no, unlike the yeshivas, I can tell you very well, the other yeshivas in Eastern Europe, did a lot of PR, maybe too much PR. And they had to go to America to raise money, and there were newspaper articles, there were ads, there were serious allegations of exaggerations, which were not unfounded. You'd see some yeshiva would claim they had 500 students. There was no Radomsk. It really was hard to research because they didn't have all this PR material, very few profiles in newspapers, very few real-time information, and sadly, very few survivors amongst the Talmidim, and the Anhala. There are a few Talmidim I could name, that are fairly well known. Gedalia Felder, the noted posek, was learned in one of the yeshivas. Baruch Shimon Schneerson, the son-in-law of the Chabina Rav, who inherited his yeshiva in Yerushalayim. Chatzkel Grubner in Detroit, who's pretty well known. He is the father-in-law of Yitzchak Siratskin. I think Rabbi Lowy from Toronto, right? Is also his son. Is also his son-in-law. Another interesting figure of Yonah Stenzel, who's somebody who was responsible, along with the Kosher Gover Gloin, for Mishnah Yomi, and then later Halacha Yomi was Talmud in the yeshiva. And then somebody else who's very interesting, who not everyone knows about, Yisrael Alter Safran Fuchs. I don't know if you know who that was. He was the a Talmud of the Rogatchover who inherited his position after the Rogatchover died, and more importantly, he was one of those who was involved in saving all of his ksavim, which now are still being put out. I was actually in the YU library recently and got a glimpse of some of them there. Side note: the new book that came out about the Rogatchover is pretty interesting. I would say that the Hebrew version, if you can master it, is probably a better read. The English version is also interesting, but the translation is a bit. I would say it loses some of its seder, its order. It's a bit all over the place, but I would definitely recommend buying the book either way, whether English or Hebrew. You learn a lot about the Rogatchover, and there's what to learn about it. Let me tell you.
Yeah, that's the English translation just came out. It's available in stores. Big black book on the Rogatchover. So, okay, something else about the Kesser Torah Yeshiva system. So, you mentioned there was 36 yeshivas. Some cities had more than one yeshiva. Did the Bachrim, therefore, was it like a local yeshiva, or did they come from elsewhere? And together,
No.
But also, something you talk about this in the article, it's an open door policy. They weren't only Radomsk exclusive. That's who went to the yeshiva. What were the background of the Bachrim?
So I wouldn't say open door as in, anyone could just show up and learn. Obviously, there were some requirements if you wanted to be able to learn there, but there was no policy that you had to be a chassid of Radomsk. And also, interestingly, there was no recruiting, meaning if you came there and you were above for chassid, nobody tried to convince you to become a Radomsk chassid. Maybe, I do have at the end of the article as a sidebar I found in one of the Yizkor books, the Yizkor book for Auschwitzin, which is Auschwitz. There was a Radomsk yeshiva there, and I found one of the students there was a son of a Rosh Yeshiva there. Wrote a fascinating article there about the yeshiva there. So obviously, amongst the Bachrim, like there was never Chassidish yeshiva. There was the regular games, bickering about whose Rebbe was greater, and you got to join our Chasidus and all that. But the greatest proof that there was none of that recruiting is that the Rosh Yeshivas of the Radomsk yeshivas were more often than not Radomsk Chassidim. Yosef Lasser, who led the Kibbutz Kavaya, was a Belzer Chassid. Somebody else, another Rosh Yeshiva, Shmuel Elbaum, was somebody who came from a Lithuanian yeshiva. The yeshiva in Chanoch was led by Rav Chaim Tobias, who at some point I think was associated with the Rabbinical Seminary in Berlin before. So you're all over the place. Rabbi Yisrael Yitzchak Pekarsky, who later is the Rosh Yeshiva in Tamkei Tumim in Crown Heights for many years. I think he inherited Rav Gusman's post there, right? A great Torah scholar. He was a Rosh Yeshiva there. Finally, I can mention once again one of my favorites is Rav Shimon Lazelachaver, who was the Mashgiach and Chachmei Lublin, an otherworldly figure, Makubal. He was a Rosh Yeshiva also in one of the Kesser Torah yeshivas. So you have this yeshiva that's for the people, by the people, with the people. This is not a Radomsk. This is not a push to recruit people into Radomsk, and maybe that's part of why it was so successful.
Yeah, really, definitely fascinating and unique. Where was the yeshiva headquartered, and also how centralized was it in the sense that when they came up what they were learning, was that set out from like the top, or did each local yeshiva, did they learn things differently, or was it all one centralized?
So because the yeshivas, first of all, some of them were yeshiva Ketana, some of them were for older Bachram. No, I don't think they were learning the same thing at the same time. There was a system of testing where Moshe for many years traveled around to all the yeshivas and they would have these days, where it would be these faheres during the day, and then at night they would have a grand siyum and a grand suda celebration where you read from the memoirs, you see what how the whole towns would shut down on the day that Rav came there to conduct these faheres and for this big celebration. And because the local Radomsk Chasidus, like I said before, the way the Rebbe set it up, half of the budget came from him personally. The other half came from his Chassidim that were located in that enclave, in that town. So they all had a share in the yeshivas. They felt like the yeshivas were theirs. They were very proud of them. And you see a lot of them, would send their sons there, but not all of them. Not all of them sent their sons there. And there was no problem. Another name, Yankel or Jack Finkelstein, who's pretty well-known Mir Talmud. Many of his grandkids floating around. He had learned one of their yeshivas and went from there to something that was maybe the closest thing to a Lutvische version, but had many differences, was Navardik, right? And Navardik yeshivas had, Radomsk was they had money, Navardik famously had nothing, and that was part of that. That was some of the issues they had. But he had learned in, I don't believe he came from a family of Radomsk Chasidus either. But I wouldn't say there was a uniformity among them when it came to what they were learning, at the same time. But the idea and values were the same. For example, the Rebbe was very strict that Chassidus should not be a main subject learned there. Maybe it was like Musar was in some Lithuanian yeshivas. But he once found out that in one of the yeshivas, they were on Fridays, which I think anyways, Lithuanian yeshivas probably were closed. But they were learning Tver Shlomo, his great grandfather's sefer, and he got very upset. And he says, "Do they know all of Shas and Baiskim? They started to learn Tver Shlomo." So you see, it was not and I think part of that also was he didn't want to be pushing Radomsk. So maybe some of that came from some of the reason why I didn't want them learning that, but there was definitely some Chassidus being learned there. I would imagine, just like in Chachmei Blin, we like to talk about it. Chachmei Blin for many years on Rosh Hashanah was the Uman of its time, because the Breslov Chassidim could not get to Uman, which was in the Soviet Union, or I guess was in Russia then. They couldn't cross over or get stuck. They get stuck there. So they needed a large place in Poland to have Rosh Hashanah, and Rav Meir Shapiro gave over yeshiva to them. Why? Because it was a Chassidish yeshiva, and he would let the Bachram all go to their Rebbes for Rosh Hashanah, as Chassidim to Yom Tov, as Chassidim tend to do. So I'd imagine, a lot of the same thing going on over there. I don't know if any of the Kesser Torah Yeshivas became, Breslov then, but or turned over to Breslov, but I would imagine that they were closed then because the Bachman would go to their Rebbes. Many would go to Sosnovich, to their Radomsk Rebbe.
So, unfortunately, the yeshiva's demise was the Nazis, was World War II?
Absolutely, yeah.
With the Chasidus. Just
along, you say Beis Yaakov. Beis Yaakov was peaking, right, at the time of... And I would say, Rabbi Dr. David Katz, not of Vilna, but of Baltimore, who we both know, once spent the Shabbos with them, and taught me something important, which I never even thought of, is that, we were all taught that, that European Jewry had bottomed out prior to World War II. And it's probably not the case when it comes to Torah learning. I think it was on the upswing very much, especially you look at Beis Yaakov and what was being done then, and how many girls... The rise of Beis Yaakov, I think Kesser Torah kind of shadowed that in a sense. It was growing by leaps and bounds yearly. I think that even the 36 yeshivas, I think that probably got up to 40 or 42 right on the eve of Second World War, although I don't have documentation for that. So, and the 36 number is one that they tended to use, so I'll stick with that.
So the article focuses a lot on what we discussed. There's also a lot of stories there are stories of the Rebbe, not Chassidish Amaisis, but there's a lot of stories of the Rebbe. Something else, and again, it talks a lot about Rameshala, and it talks about Rameshala's son was unfortunately left young, and then there was just Rameshala and the Sfarim, things that we've mentioned here. But something else is that I found fascinating is, as we mentioned, the Rebbe was really this business mogul, a very rich man, and there was a kind of failed plan to swap land with the Germans. I want to just mention that it really, unfortunately,
Before
didn't
we
come to
get to
fruition.
before we get to the sad ending, you talked about stories of the Rebbe, and like I said, I'm not a Rebbe stories kind of guy, but there's one story. There was one story that I came across, that I wrote, that I put into this article, which really blew my mind. And I think if you asked me, what the idea of what a great Rebbe is, just Dovi Safier personally, I think this story sums it up. There was an elderly Talmid Chacham who lived in Sosnovich, who was very close with the Rebbe. He was older than he was, closer to his father's age. His name was Yitzchak Elimelech Hakohen Singer, he was a descendant of the Noam Elimelech. He put out a sefer called Zichron Elimelech, and he was a close friend of the Rebbe's. And the story goes that it was Erev Rosh Hashanah at 3:00 in the morning, right, the night before Rosh Hashanah, and this Ramelech Singer is in the Rebbe's private base medrash, sitting and learning, and the Rebbe walks in as well, and Rabbi Singer, Ramelech Singer says to the Rebbe, he says, "What are you doing at 3:00 in the morning, the night before Hashanah? You're not a healthy person. You have to be rested up. Tomorrow, Erev Rosh Hashanah is one of the busiest days of the year for Rebbe. You have thousands of Chassidim from across Europe coming to see you." He says, who could sleep? The pachad from the emes hadin, right? The fear from being judged by Hashem, can't sleep. And he says the same thing. He goes, Melech, what are you doing up? And it seemed the same idea. So the two of them sat together and they learned the Bissel until Slichas and then davening. You can only imagine what time it was when he was heading home. And before he departed, the Rebbe told this Melech Singer, he says, "Come into my room, I just want to give you something." And he hands him a large amount of money. And he says, if you don't mind, there's someone who lives in Sosnovich who's comes from a great Rebbe's family, a Rebbe's Einikel, he's a poor person. He doesn't have much going on in his life. Please go and bring it to him before Yom Tov. He badly needs the money. Fine, of course. So on his way home from Shachas, he stops at this person's home. He sees how he lives now in this. I can only imagine Shlomo Kalbach saying the story a lot better than I'm saying it. But he lives in this hovel, and I don't know what his name was and where he came from, but I have my suspicions. But he came from one of the great Chassidic dynasties. But the Rebbe was probably one of his third cousins, once removed or something, and he comes and he gives him an envelope, with some money. And he says, what are you doing here? He says, "Oh, this is from the Rebbe of Radomsk. He wanted me to give you a matana before Yom Tov." And he says, "I'm sorry, I can't take it." He says, "What do you mean? What do you mean I can't take it?" He says, "Ich bin an Einikel from grosser Rebbe's, right?" He says, "I don't take pidyonis, I don't take gifts without a kvittel, right? When you go to a Rebbe, you write a kvittel." And this Melech was aghast. He says, "I don't understand. Who's this guy? He wants me to write a kvittel, but okay." So he says, "Okay, do you have a pen, a paper? I'll write you a kvittel." He says, No. You're not giving me the money. I don't want a kvittel from you." He says, "I want a kvittel. I want a kvittel from the one who's giving me the money, from the Rebbe of Radomsk, from Shlomo Chanoch, Rabinowitz, Hakohen." And he doesn't know what to do. He says, now it's getting closer to Yom Tov. He says, "I don't have such chutzpah to go to the Rebbe and ask him to write out, some kvittel for this man." He says, "But okay, I have to get him the money somehow. I at least have to tell the Rebbe what's going on here." So he goes back to the Rebbe, and there's a line around the block to see the Rebbe, and he kind of slyly, goes in through the back entrance. He knows how to get in. He goes up to the Rebbe, he interrupts him, and goes over to him, and he whispers into ear what's happened. He wasn't sure if the Rebbe was going to slap him or tell him, just leave, drop the money and run. And the Rebbe looks at him and says, "Let's get my coat. We're going." And the Rebbe went to this man, to this Rebbe Einikel, who clearly was a broken person, on Erev Rosh Hashanah, the busiest day of the year, when he had everything else in the world to do. And he sits there and he writes this beautiful kvittel, and he basically, he goes at it at his feet and he hands him this kvittel. And with that he says, oh, and I'd like to give you the Rebbe a pidyon. Gives him the pidyon, kilo, like he was standing in front of the Mishpacha Sukkos or something. And that's the story. And, Ramelech Singer saying the story to Talmidim in the yeshiva and says, and you think you know your Rebbe. He says, you don't know your Rebbe. You have no idea how great he is. And, I read the story, I got very emotional. And to me, it's really, it's everything you love to hear about anyone, about a great Rebbe, about, really that type of chesed is, it's something, it's a once in a lifetime kind of story to me.
Yeah, when I read that the other day, that was a really moving story. It was really nice to read, and there are other stories as well, but that was a real, fascinating story. So, what about the end? I know it's a sad ending. Radomsk as a whole, Kesser Torah Yeshiva System. It's a not
I'm
a
not
happy
ready to give
ending.
away. I'm not ready to give away the whole ending, but it's.
By the way, the whole podcast. Just I said this, but I'll reiterate that the article, not only to pump you up and for Mishpacha, but the article itself, there is a lot more in there than we've discussed, especially for Moshe and other things. We kind of focus on Kesser Torah. The article has much more. It's 35 pages. There's many color photographs, many pictures, a lot of things there. So yeah, this is read the articles if you find this interesting, especially.
Yeah, so those of you who have read Edwin Black's book, The Transfer Agreement, I don't know if you've read it, Nachi, highly recommended, but it discusses a plan to save German Jewry before the war by swapping equipment when there was a boycott of German goods by which is really pushed by Jews in America around the world, and the Jewish agency thought they'd be able to take advantage of it. And they did save some Jews that way. And the Rebbe had an opportunity to swap land that he owned in Germany with land in Palestine then. Interestingly, land that was settled by the German Templars, missionaries many years earlier. Land that today actually is the Kiryah, the defense, the government headquarters in Tel Aviv. But due to certain circumstances, you'll see in the article, going on in the Rebbe's life, it never happened. And ultimately, the Rebbe and his family, Moshe, were killed in the Warsaw Ghetto. And that really spelled the end of Radomsk. I think there are some people today that are the Radomsk Rebbe, or there are a few Radomsk Rebbes, or Radomsk Rabbanim. To me, Shlomo Besser on the west side is the closest person that I know to being a Radomsk Rebbe. He was another person that was very helpful in writing this article. And that whole family were originally called Kashitsky, later Besser, were part of the Rebbe's inner circle, very close to the Rebbe. Let's leave it there. I think that people will read the article. I don't want to spoil everything.
No, there's a lot. Also, like I said, there's a really nice sidebar. I think it's 2 pages or more about Shlomo, which is something we didn't discuss here at all. So that's in the article and some other things in the article as well. Let me ask you some general questions because I'm sure you get these questions. I'm sure listeners who read your articles are curious about this.
So you do it by Shefkin style? You have like these questions you ask at the end?
No, these are just, I didn't want to bore people in the beginning. I wanted to get to Radomsk, but you mentioned this in the, when we were talking before, that you research. You don't want to just do like oral history kind of whatever from biographies, quote unquote. You want to do something a little bit more real or academic or sophisticated. What's the research process like? How do you go about that?
So the research process, I guess for every article is different. There are some articles where there are very good secular sources, there are archival sources. First of all, I say the wide world of Jewish history, from academics and authors and yourself and that whole bunch of friends that we have, it's really wonderful. Everyone is very helpful to one another. By now I have friends at universities from Austria and Poland down to Australia. And when I'm looking for a certain source, I'm able to get it fairly easily. Obviously, digital collections of various archives have become very helpful. And during COVID, many of them became much friendlier about scanning things. You don't actually have to go on site and visit them to get documents. But I would say I'm first and foremost a researcher. And the writing is just something that, I'm okay at. I don't enjoy it as much. I'm always constantly researching. I get lost in rabbit holes that are 50 feet deep. And I love discovering new things. So that's why I always have 5 or 6 open Google Docs with articles that I'm working on, some which never get completed. Ultimately, I always try and complete one in time for Sukkot and one in time for Pesach. So I have these articles. But the process really goes from everything to, to reading 20 to 25 books on the subject or near the subject, to visiting the various archives. And also, if for an article like this, I would say getting the photos, a lot of the rare photos in this article, was almost as hard as the writing the article and getting the information was. Not a lot of pictures of Radomsk. They were not big PR people, and had to go many different routes in order to get these pictures. Some of which are beautiful, by the way.
I think that's a big part of the articles, though, because I think Mishpacha does a beautiful job laying it out. And I think the color, the fact that people can read it with color pictures, it really adds, the visual aid really adds to the story. I think that's another, I think that really helps, the articles, and I'm sure that's part of their popularity as well.
100%, 100%. I couldn't also, I wouldn't be remiss if I didn't mention that I do have a couple of friends who have helped me a lot, definitely over the last couple of years with these articles as they've kind of taken on a life of its own. I feel like there's so much pressure to get these major articles done. Moshe Dembitzer, Yehuda Zirkin, bunch of other, obviously Yehuda Geber, who I write a weekly column with in Mishpacha, but doesn't usually do larger articles. I mean, he's too busy these days with his tours, by the way. Highly recommended. He's, I would say in Eastern Europe. Yeah, in Eastern, if you are doing an Eastern Europe trip these days, there almost is no other tour guide, to get. If he's available, you get him because he is the best. And his tours in Israel are amazing too. But, he's become very busy with that, so he hasn't necessarily had the time. I'm not sure how I have the time to do these articles. People say, when do you do them? Often between 1 and 5 a.m. Friday mornings. But I love the research. I wouldn't say I love the writing as much. It's tough sometimes, especially when it's that long. But I'll keep at it.
This question, I'm sure many people want to know: how do you pick the topic, or does the topic pick you?
I think there's a lot of siyata d'shmaya involved in this, and I mean it. I feel like, as I said, I also have 5 Google Docs open. I would say 3 or 4 different articles. I'd say I have half of the research done and 20% of the writing done. And somehow, as I get closer to Yom Tov, I start to feel a little bit closer to one. I feel like one story really grips me. I also try and I try and not do 2 in a row that have a lot of crossover. So I'm not going to write about, Slobodka and then about Mir something, but there's always a Mir connection to every story, right? But, I'm not going to write about 2 things that have a lot of crossover back to back. But yeah, there's no real answer to that question. I wish I knew myself. But very often I do find afterwards, like, sometimes it's yard site, like it'll be 100th yard site of someone or something like that, which is why I do it then. The other times it's random.
Is there any thought of compiling these into a book at some point?
There's lots of thought about lots of books. Let's put it that way. But I think, yes, the answer is yes. I hope to I have been working on that. I discussed it with a couple of publishers. I'm happy to discuss it with more publishers. I'd love to find someone who is going to help me a little bit in organizing them and deciding which articles to put in the first volume, second volume. I don't have enough clarity on that yet. I'd like to add footnotes. I'm not going to say it's going to be, I'm going to make them into academic articles, but at least, some of the material, someone's going to say, okay, where do you get that from? I do try in these articles, Mishpacha that has no footnotes. The way the article is printed is not really space for footnotes. They don't do footnotes or endnotes, but I think they think it'll scare away a lot of their readers. But I think when I do compile them into a book, this first volume, I think I have probably about 12 or 13 of them right now. I think that I would definitely include some footnotes.
How many questions do you get about the Jenny book? Do you still get Jenny? You said you're putting it in the book. People ask me about you if you're writing a book on this, by the way, all the time.
So yes, so the answer is the Jenny book is going to happen. There's no doubt. I think I may have to take a little break from writing these articles for a little while in order to finish it. But I'm constantly doing more research on the Jenny Miller story, which if you don't know about the mother of all yeshivas, you could just give it Jenny Miller. You could search it, find the story online. It's a story that I wrote a couple of years ago, which is really taken off beyond what I ever dreamed. And her caver has become a site of many visit to Davin in Philadelphia, and her story this year on her yard site. I think that besides for Torah Masorah, who sends out an email now to the hundreds of Jewish day schools in its network, yeshivas like Mir and Chaim Berlin and Lakewood, all on their own, hung up signs that you should learn this year in memory of this woman who really kept our yeshivas going many years ago when we had nothing, and unfortunately has no descendants. And we are all her spiritual descendants. I don't know one of these yeshivas, and it's something that I'm very proud of.
Yeah, that was, I think, without question, your biggest hit of your articles. So,
I would say not. But to answer your question, I don't think a week goes by when someone doesn't come over to me, email me, text me. There are some serial stalkers who, like, every couple of days, like, hey, any updates? I said, no, I spoke to you on Tuesday and today is Thursday. Nothing's really happened since then. But I definitely, I have to decide, exactly which way I'm going to go about it. Publisher, and I have a couple of different options in terms of the style, which I've going back and forth on. But I'm definitely at work on it. Right. I initially said 2024. I can't imagine it's still going to be released in 2024. If I complete it, I would hope I could complete it by Pesach, if I was being honest.
Okay, now you're going to get a lot of questions by Pesach time. I'm just warning you.
I know.
But, okay.
Part of the fun.
All right. So with that, thank you, Dovi, for joining me, and for everybody. This podcast is being posted Sunday, October 13th, right after Yom Kippur. So the Mishpacha will be out Monday. I don't know whenever it comes out.
I don't know, Sunday, Monday. It's always a surprise.
It'll be out this week, Mishpacha, and of course those that subscribe get it. We'll just get it anyways. And of course you can subscribe to Mishpacha to get these twice a year. But Sukkos and Pesach.
What else? What else should people be reading over Sukkos? Have any book recommendations?
I don't know. What am I going to read? Now I read your article to prepare for this. Now I can't read it over Yom Tov. No, I have enough books. I'm reading I was telling you about this the other day. I have the new biography of the Chacham Tzvi by Rabbi Dr. Yossi Levine, published by Lippmann. It's not out yet. It'll be out November 29th, but that's
very good, like a good way to tease people, right?
That's
like,
a good way to
tease. And you're not getting it, so ha.
But I will say, you mentioned the Rogachover. I'll also say Yardena Schwartz's book. You put me in touch with her. I like that very much. I think that's a good read for anybody interested in reading about the Hebron massacre in 1929. I mean, interested. I will say, for those reading on Yom Tov, you may tear up in the middle. It's a pretty sad story. It's called Ghosts of a Holy War, the 1929 massacre in Palestine that ignited the Arab-Israeli conflict. So it's definitely sad. It's written really well. It's a good book, but it's a sad book. That's something new. You mentioned the Rogachover, though it's got like that AI translation. I don't know if it actually was, but that's like what it.
No, it's not an AI translation. That's pushing it, but it's better than that. But it's like unfortunately, most books we've seen lately that are translated from Hebrew that don't invest a lot of money into the translation, which is understood. But we definitely, I don't understand why more books that are written in Hebrew are not translated into English. But maybe the answer is there's a lack of translators, and technology will make that easier. But definitely those who don't read Hebrew are missing out on a lot of great books. I was very, very happy when another one of my mentors, Ben-Zion Klobansky, who's the expert in interwar yeshivas, and his book was translated on the interwar yeshivas. In English, in Hebrew, it's Kesser Chalamish. I don't know I don't recall off the top of my head the English name of the book, but if you haven't read that one, it's a must read. I can tell you, I've given it to a couple of members of Mishpacha Sukkos Torah who enjoyed that book immensely. It's a very, very worthy read from a wonderful author and an even more wonderful person.
The golden age of the Lithuanian yeshivas.
That's it.
Yeah,
it.
You can buy
must
it.
read.
40
Must
bucks
read
on
for
Amazon.
anyone who learned yeshivas, is interested in yeshivas, who's not interested in yeshivas. Incredible book.
Any other new books that jumped out to you that you could recommend for reading? I mean, we gave those two. I'm sorry I teased the.
I saw a couple of Ephraim Ushri's books were redone.
Yeah.
Those are always interesting. I have not seen the redone versions. Also very sad, more like Tisha B'Av style reads. But you know me, I'm not reading new books. I'm going to Mizrahi and I'm finding the old ones. That's what interests me. That's where I find material more often than not. There's a new book on the Minsk Gadol, which is interesting because it's based on. I haven't had a chance to really read it, but it's based on a manuscript which was found, which was never published. The book was actually written by someone, I think a son-in-law, many, many years ago. So that might be interesting. I haven't read it yet, but what I read lately, I finally read Adam Teller's book, which you had recommended to me, which is fascinating.
Terrific.
Fascinating.
Rescue
really,
the
really
Surviving
worthy.
Souls, I think it's called. Highly recommend.
Yes. By the way, we don't only read depressing books, the two of us, but mostly I would say Jewish history is depressing. So what do we?
Conception of Jewish history. What did Sailor Baron say? That's excellent. I would say also for listeners, if you haven't read the Sheikhet, I highly recommend it. And Volume 2 is coming out right after Sukkos. It's
the Shochet or the Sheikhet?
The Shochet. It was pronounced in Yiddish. You probably
yes, we loved it. I think I recommended it the last time I was on your podcast, and I'm eagerly awaiting Volume 2. I'm hoping I'll get an advanced copy from a certain neighbor of mine who's involved in the publication of these books.
I haven't heard.
She's listening.
It's for some reason they're missing the Yom Tov cutoff. It's coming out October 22nd. I don't know what's up with that. They couldn't get it out for you because
it's an academic book. Academic books can't come out in time for Yom Tov.
It's in all the stores and it sold really well. I think people really enjoyed it a lot. It was really an excellent book. So that
someone's got to work on that on the distribution. That book, I think Turo being involved helped Academic Studies Press now has figured out a way to distribute books in various Judaica stores, and it's been a problem that a lot of the academic presses have had is figuring out how to distribute these books. And I'm not sure if they know or understand. Instead of selling 200 or 300 copies of a lot of these books, they could sell a couple thousand. If they're distributed properly. So that's something somebody's got to get involved in, I think.
Well, that's one issue. The other issue is the price. There's another book, actually, so I got it.
No, but now that they're all doing, a lot of them are doing paperback copies that are very affordable.
So, right. Some, for example, I don't understand when they are or they aren't. So if the presses are listening, maybe they could figure this out. I'll give another example. Academic Studies Press published a book that I'm in the middle of. I started it. It's fascinating. It's a biography of Shlomo Dubno. Solomon Dubno. They wrote Solomon Dubno. Shlomo Dubno, who was... it's titled Shaping the Jewish Enlightenment, Solomon Dubno, 1738 to 1813, an Eastern European maskil who he was involved with Mendelssohn. He wrote the beer on Bereshis, but then he had a fight and he left and he wanted to write his own thing. He has Askamas from Chaim Volozhiner and others.
Not to be confused with Dubno the historian.
Correct, totally different. But he's a fascinating figure. There's a lot of fascinating material in this book. And it's $130 hardcover. Like I got a free copy. I have no idea why there's no paperback to this book. And this is a good book. It's a biography. It's very good. I can recommend anyone interested in that topic at all. And Dubno was a fascinating figure to read the book, but it's unfortunately $130. So I don't know. But there are definitely we don't only read new books. We read plenty of old books as well. There's also some. By the way, for those, I don't know if it's really available. And if you want a Hebrew. The Rebbe of Radomsk biography of the Orach Chaim HaKadosh, told us Rabbeinu Chaim Ben Attar was just redone. I don't know if it's available by air. If someone wants a Hebrew book, it also has a sefer in there. It has Torah in there. Book. It's got like everything in there, which is another fascinating one. That it might be available. It's done by Avad Shalom, so it might be available.
I'm turning around to the shelf behind me. I'm pulling off a couple of books that just I can tell you that people have told me. That I've recommended over the years that people really love. One of them is actually Rabbi Mordechai Kamenetsky, just finished reading this book. I think I gave it to him or recommended it to him, and he told me that he has since read it and shared it with others. Memories of Two Generations, A Yiddish Life in Russia and Texas by Alexander Z. Gurwitz, which is a fascinating book. Also is one of those memoirs which kind of got lost and was never properly published and was found in a university library, ended up being published, and really, really a great book. Another one is I visited I was in the YU library last week, and I visited the great Shlomo Berger, who runs the archives there. I don't say great lightly because she's really a great woman and always very helpful. And she knows a Welt. And she was talking about her friend who passed away. You had on her podcast, Sarah Rieger, and a book that you discussed you had a podcast on My Father's Journey, Memoir of Lost Worlds of Jewish Lithuania, about Simcha Zelig Rieger and his son, which is really another, The Brisker Dying, which is a fascinating book as well. There's just two books standing behind me, both good reads for Yom Tov if you're looking something to read. In between all of your Starim and your Daf Yomi and everything else, it's really Bornstein.
I think memoirs are always great. There's another one, there's somehow all the books this year are missing Yom Tov. There's another memoir coming out that I have an advanced copy, so I'm like looking. I think what I have, but it's actually not out yet. I see on Amazon, but sometimes they deliver early if you pre-order it. There's a book being published, The Civil War Diary of Emma Mordecai. So this is a diary of a woman who was religious in the South during the Civil War. It's a new edition. There's an extensive introduction by Dan Ashton, who actually passed away before the book went to press. So it's finished by Melissa Clapper, finished the book. It's actually quite interesting if you're interested, again, in memoirs of a totally different sort. But it's, again, I don't know, unless they deliver it early, it's coming out after Yom Tov. So, but it'll be out at the end of October. Just another...
Oh, wow. Looking forward to that. Another advanced copy, which I did not receive. I do get some advanced copies, but I'm not like you or Bashevkin or someone. I maybe have to start a podcast, instead of writing columns that are read by, 50,000 people, that to get those advanced copies. But definitely when I ask for them, I get them. So
yeah, just have to ask. Exactly. You'll write articles. So, all right, listen, there's some book recommendations, and of course, pick up the Mishpacha. You can read about Dovi's article about Radomsk and check that out. Thank you, Dovi, for joining me once again. And
thanks for having me.
And for the listeners, wishing everyone a Chag Sameach. There may be, I don't know yet, there may be an episode on Chol Hamoed, so stay tuned. Maybe yes, maybe no. If not, we'll be back after Yom Tov. And so,
what are people going to do in the Chol Hamoed trips if they don't have an episode? Come on, do it now.
This is like a full week of Chol Hamoed. I don't know. I feel like no one's listening to podcasts on Chol Hamoed. Isn't everyone going around?
Well, you have your drive. You have to drive to. I mean, I guess it's for the New Yorkers. There's a lot of sporting events, put it that way. But people need something to listen to and from the podcast. Well, we're not Mike and the Mad Dog, although we could do that at a different time. Talk about the Yankees and the Mets and the Jets and the Giants. A lot going on now.
Yeah, maybe there'll be a Subway series.
Indian, but I say Indian.
Yeah, exactly. All right, thanks, Dovi.
I think that's still the championship series then, but
it is. All right, I didn't check the calendar yet. All right,
past junior sports knowledge.
Not a New York sports fan. I'll leave it at that. All right, all right. Thank you.